Your Majesty, when people think about the Arab world, they think that this is not a part of the world that is managing diversity well. They look at Iraq and the conflict between the Shias and the Sunnis. They look at the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the angle between the Jews and Muslims and Arabs. Is the Arab world going through a kind of intolerant phase? How should we think about this problem? And is it fair to say that it is not managing diversity well?
Well, I think you have to look at it in terms of what's going on inside the Arab world and what's going on between the Arab world and the West. And I think what we've found, what I'm finding very alarming, is just how much the rifts between East and West have deepened. And I think that that is something that we really have to address. Extremist ideology, I think, is getting a lot of resonance. And we really need to examine why that's happening. And I think that extreme ideology throughout history has always existed, whether it's religious or political or otherwise. But they've always existed on the fringes, because by nature, human beings are moderates. But what happens is that they are being pulled into the center by two forces. The first force is the lack of knowledge that we have of one another. So for example, when the West looks at the Arab world, they don't see it in its diversity. When we look at some of the extremist groups, we tend to lump them all into one group, which is wrong. So it's great that people know that there are Shiites and Kurds and Sunnis inside Iraq, but we need to look further and see what they represent. We need to realize that there are different types of Shiites, for example, in the Arab world. There are the ones that are secular, the ones that are religious, there are the political groups who have different agendas, etc. So this kind of nuanced approach is critical in this day and age for us to be able to deal effectively with some of the challenges that we're facing. Otherwise, we will not be able to understand what the issues that we're dealing with are. So I think the challenge for the 21st century is to have a more sophisticated and nuanced approach in understanding one another. And I find that quite baffling because, at this day and age, with increased globalization, on a daily basis, we're dealing with people from different countries and different cultures. We're using products that come from different countries, etc. Yet we're not armed with the knowledge that we need to really understand one another, and that only comes through human interaction, person-to-person interaction. That's something that we really have to emphasize going forward. And it just reminds me that living in the same neighborhood is not multiculturalism. You have to invite people into your home. You have to have an open mind and open heart. And we have to try to combat a lot of the stereotypes and the prejudices that exist in our part of the world. Because when there is prejudice, then there's fear. And what we're seeing now is an ideology of hatred turning into a culture of fear. And when people are scared, then they choose isolation over integration. And that's why we're seeing that the diversity is not being managed very well. The other factor that I think brings the extremists into the center is when you have grievances that have not been dealt with. And I think the main grievance that we have left to fester for way too long is the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And for me, that just acts like almost a blockade that rivals any army or any navy in stopping the goodwill from flowing between East and West. Because there's so much despair, there's so much frustration, there's so much lack of hope. It affects, this is the issue that is at the core of our region, in the heart of every Arab. And people really feel with that cause. And as you know, the extremists, they tend to feed off of this despair. So the more there are injustices in our part of the world, the more of an argument that extremists have to recruit people into their ranks. So if you tell me, if we solve the Palestinian-Israeli problem, will Bin Laden disappear overnight? He will not disappear, he will still exist. But his ability to lure people into his ranks will be greatly diminished. And that is why it's critical for us to try to find a solution to this problem. And I hope that today people realize that having a solution, finding a solution for the Israelis and Palestinians, although it's directly affect the Israelis and Palestinians in the Arab world, but all of us have a stake in that peace, because it affects all of our lives in very direct ways. Whether it's a threat of terrorism that can affect people from all over the world, or it's even the prices of oil. For example, there's a there is a great pressure among in some of the oil-producing countries for them to use the oil as a card. And you know, if oil prices go up to $150 a barrel or $200 a barrel, then that's going to affect your average guy living in Ohio. So, so it's very important that we all realize that we actually have a stake in the peace in the Middle East, and to really, it takes courage, it takes global commitment, and it takes honest progress, but we have to do it. And if we keep ruling out political approaches and relying on military action, we are seeing that military action is not the way to deal with things.
But may I ask you about... May I ask you about this issue of extremists and intolerance? Because it does strike one from the outside that there has been a rise over the last decades of a kind of extreme interpretation of Islam that is quite intolerant. So 2 Western journalists get captured in Gaza, and they are forced to convert to Islam at gunpoint, which it seems to me is a terrible betrayal of the Palestinian cause, which has included among its ranks very prominent Christians. Indeed, in many ways, Arab nationalism was invented or certainly articulated best by Arab Christians. So when people look at that in the West, I think they wonder, when are Arab moderates going to condemn this kind of extreme intolerance? What is your sense of how things are going in the Arab world there? You and your husband are among the most prominent Arab moderates. Do you feel that you have been able to stand up to these extreme forces? Are you being joined by others in the Arab world, or is this a lonely path?
I just want to say that not only, the example that you cited, not only is it a betrayal to the Palestinian people, but it's also a betrayal to Islam itself, because there's no coercion in Islam. You can't force people to become Muslims if they don't believe. And whether people are becoming more radicalized in our part of the world, I mean, I'd like to say, for example, like 2 months ago, before the war in Lebanon began, here's Lebanon, which is made up of a group of people that are peace-loving, they're very moderate and open and modern by nature, they're the natural allies to the global community. And then this war took place, and innocent civilians were being killed. We were over the summer, it was a very long, hot summer, and I don't mean temperature-wise. You know, we were seeing on a daily basis bodies of babies being put in plastic bags. Vital infrastructure was destroyed, a quarter of the population was displaced. And I can say that over the course of 2 months, the Arab public became much more radicalized, because they saw this injustice, they saw this grief. And even the moderate, what we thought was a moderate majority, started to shrink, and you can see this shrinking taking place. And the extreme voices came out as the victorious ones. And you could see that the voice of moderation, the voices that called for peace and diplomacy and engagement, they're losing currency. They're being marginalized. So if you want to strengthen the moderates, we have to see, people have to see the dividends of moderation. They have to see the dividends of peace. And now they're not seeing them. So again, I just want to say that if we want to gain the moderates, if we want to increase, it's almost percentages, you know, the percentage of extremists to moderates. If you want to increase and strengthen your moderate bloc, then people have to really feel an important difference in their lives. They have to see justice, they have to see, and as I said, an honest engagement and an interest in their cause.